Now for Lecture 3 in our Early Modern series, the Americas in the Early Modern Period. I chose this picture for the Americas in the Early Modern Period because if we look, it's a good representation of what the Spanish are going to do in the New World. If we see in the top right-hand corner of the picture, the Spanish are going to use the natives as a labor source. And we'll talk about what kind of coercive labor source they're going to do. And it's going to be in mining and lumbering and things like that. If you look in the top center of the picture, you will see some Native Americans hanging. And this is referencing what is known as the Black Legend. When the Spanish come to the New World, there will be lots of violence with this early contact. We'll see that the Spanish are interested in conquering the natives, forcing them to convert to Catholicism, as we see in the top left-hand side of the picture with the cross. And anybody that doesn't convert or fights the Spanish are killed. That's basically the first phase of the Spanish in the New World. In the 1500s, we'll see this phase of conquest, domination, killing the natives, those kinds of things. But then in the late 1500s and then in the 1600s and 1700s, we're going to see kind of a second phase of the Spanish in the New World. And that is, instead of killing the Native Americans, they're going to use them as a labor source and want to convert them. So we see them both reflected in this picture. The conquest phase, when we see Native Americans being killed, and then we also see the control phase, which comes later, where we see using the Native Americans as a labor source, whether it's in farming or lumbering or mining or those kinds of things. And then finally, what we see in the bottom right-hand side of the picture is the Spanish are also going to change the New World to a great deal. They're going to bring in new crops. They're going to bring in new animals, cows, pigs, sheep, goats, those kind of things and horses, which haven't been in the New World before as part of the Columbian Exchange. And so we're going to see this as a dramatic period of change for the Americas. Letter A, Spain and the Caribbean. So we're going to start our story with the Spanish in the New World by going to 1492 when Columbus, quote unquote, discovers the New World. Now, the first place he's going to land is in the Caribbean. Again, and Columbus thinks that he is in the island someplace off India or China, and so he calls these people that he discovers Indians, even though they're Native Americans. And one of the first group of people he meets are the Taino Indians in the Caribbean. It's a very sad story of the Taino Indians. When Columbus meets them and he claims the land for the islands that he found for Spain, he notices that the Native Americans have gold on them as jewelry, and this excites him. He thinks, well, this would be something that could bring money back to Spain and make King Ferdinand and Queen Isabel happy with me and fund more voyages. And so that will cause the Spanish want to bring more ships back and find the source of this gold. In addition to that, he makes the comment in his diary that the Native Americans seem very peaceful people and they could be used easily for a slave force or some kind of a labor source. And he brings a couple of the Native Americans back to Spain to show this off. And so we're going to see that the Taino Indians very quickly are going to disappear. Within just 50 years of contact with the Spanish, a good portion of the Taino Indians are going to be wiped out through disease and overwork. And it's going to be an example of what we're going to see playing out in a much bigger picture in the rest of the New World. So in the early 1500s, the Spanish, as I said on the first slide, they're all about conquest. This is their conquest phase, and they're going to use the Caribbean where they first land as a base of operations to go and explore other places. Whether it's looking for the Fountain of Youth up there in Florida, as you can see on the map, or looking to conquer the Aztecs or the Incas, the Caribbean is going to be a place that's a jumping-off point for future Spanish explorations of conquest in the New World. So once we get past this conquest phase, the Spanish are going to look for a different way of dealing with natives. So we'll talk more about the conquest in a second. But once the Spanish come into a region, for example, like the Caribbean, what they do is after they conquer, then they don't want to kill the natives anymore. They want to use them as a labor force to grow their crops that they're going to use to make money in the New World. And so what the Spanish do is they import something that they're very used to back in Europe. During the post-classical period or the medieval period, Europeans used this system called manoralism, where you'd have a noble in charge of a large piece of land, and all the European peasants or serfs would work that land for him, and they were kind of semi-slaves. He didn't buy and sell the serfs individually, but they were tied to the land. They couldn't leave the land. And so when the Spanish come to the New World, they're going to duplicate that system because it's what they're used to. And so in Europe, it's called manoralism, and in the New World, it's called the encomienda system. The encomienda system, as we see here, it's just like manoralism. The Spanish conquistador, when he's done conquering, he will get a large chunk of land, and then he will use the Native Americans to work that land for him. So he controls their labor. So this isn't exactly slave labor, but it is a coercive labor source, this encomienda system, where he's using them as peasant labor, as almost like serfs. In addition to that, one of the other reasons the Spanish come to the New World, besides gold and conquering, is they also want conversion. They're coming for God. Now, back in Europe, if we were to do kind of a regional link, a world link, Europe is going through the Reformation, and there's this competition between Catholics and Protestants to see who gets to dominate Europe. But it's not just Europe, because we're also going to bring in exploration. And so Protestants and Catholics in Europe are also competing to see who can convert the rest of the world to their branch of Christianity. And so the Catholics are inspired to come to the New World, and they bring Jesuit priests with them. And these Jesuit priests, it is their mission to convert the natives to Catholicism as part of this worldwide competition for Christianity. And so we'll see that this conquistador in the top picture, not only is he telling the natives what to do, but also there's a Jesuit priest with him who will try to convert the natives to their faith. Many natives are going to die even during the control phase, even though the Spanish are not actively trying to kill the Native Americans because they don't want to. They want to use them for their labor. Many, many, many Native Americans will die off. Estimates vary. The highest number I've seen is about 98% of the Native American population dies off. Some say 90, some say a little bit less. But whatever the number is, it's a very large number of Native Americans that are going to die off, either through overwork from the Spanish or through the introduction of diseases, part of the Columbian Exchange. The Native Americans have no resistance to smallpox and measles. They've never been exposed with before. So when we have this first contact, the Europeans bring with them smallpox and measles and a host of other diseases that's going to wipe out a large portion of the Native American population. So now we're going to switch to the early 1600s in the Caribbean. And the Spanish are going to lose interest in the Caribbean. They have discovered most of the islands by 1600, and they have found out that for the most part there's no gold or large deposits of silver in the Caribbean, and there's no large-scale civilizations to conquer. And so the Spanish start looking more and more to the mainland for their interest. And so we see that the shift of New Spain, its focus will go away from the Caribbean and go to mainland Mexico and South America because there's large-scale civilizations there to conquer and also lots of people to control that they could use for labor. But also that's where the biggest deposits of gold and silver are, especially silver. So the Caribbean now kind of shifts its focus from being the focus, like I said, of Spanish in the New World. Now it's going to be an important port area where we dig the gold and the silver out of our mines in the mainland, and then we ship them to the Caribbean, Spanish forts in the Caribbean. They load them onto galleons, and then large fleets of Spanish galleons will then take that silver and gold back to Europe, helping Spain's economy. But of course, this is the age of national rivalries, mercantilism, where we see European countries are constantly competing for domination. And so England, France, the Dutch, they know that the Spanish are bringing these boatloads of silver and gold back from the New World. And so this is the age of piracy, the pirates of the Caribbean. That's an example of national rivalries. Countries are hiring pirates, buccaneers, to go and rob the Spanish of some of the boats that are full of gold and silver and then bring that back to England or the Netherlands or France. And again, this fits into mercantilism or mercantilism because it's the belief that if my piece of the world pie of the wealth gets bigger, then my enemies must get smaller. So if I rob them of wealth, not only am I getting wealthier, but I'm also hurting my enemy. So national rivalries. Then when we get into the later 1600s, Spanish interest as far as making money in the Caribbean will be re-energized. So what we see here in the later 1600s, the Spanish realize that they can use the Caribbean's tropical climate to grow sugar. And sugar is a crop that is much desired in Europe. Europe is too far north to grow a lot of sugar. Now, the Portuguese up to this point had dominated sugar production because of their colonies in the Azores and the Canary Islands, but now Spain realizes that they can grow just as much sugar, even more sugar than the Portuguese can. And so the Spanish, a new wave of Spanish immigrants comes to the New World to settle in the Caribbean to grow sugar plantations, to have sugar plantations and send it back to Europe. Now, at first, they try to use the local natives as a labor force because the Spanish aren't going to grow the sugar themselves. But that doesn't work because the Native Americans, like we said before, quickly die off, or maybe they run up into the mountains of the island and the Spanish have a tough time finding them. And so Native Americans are not a good labor source. And so this creates the need for a large labor source that's going to be fulfilled by African slavery. Now, as we've talked about in the past, African slavery in the Atlantic is already started by the Portuguese to capture Africans from the coast and bring them to the Azores and the Canary Islands in the Atlantic Ocean to grow sugar. And so the Spanish are just going to be continuing that trend as they bring millions of Native Africans will eventually come across the Atlantic during this time period to the New World, most of them going to the Caribbean and Brazil to grow sugar, which is it's a big money maker for the Spanish and the Portuguese. So now we go to our next section, B, Iberians in Central and South America. Iberians means Spanish and Portuguese. The countries of Spain and Portugal are on the Iberian Peninsula, and typically we can group these two groups of Europeans together. Their experience in the New World is going to be very similar. So let's start with Mexico, the mainland of Central America. So Mexico in 1521, the Spanish are going to send conquistadors, conquerors, to the New World to see what there is on the mainland. And again, from the Native Americans in the Caribbean, they had found out that they were getting their gold from trading with Native Americans on the mainland. And so the Spanish will send their fleets to the New World, stop off in the Caribbean, get resupplied. I had told you that's a kind of a supply base. And then they're going to send their ships to the mainland of Mexico. When they get to Mexico, they land on the coast and they find a very large civilization called the Aztec Empire. And the Spanish like this because they know if there's a large centralized state that they can conquer, there's probably a good deal of wealth and a lot of people that they could use as a labor source and convert. And so about 100 conquistadors or warriors under a commander named Cortez, they will come to the coast of Mexico and they will hike up the coast, up into the mountains of central Mexico, and they will discover the capital of Mexico, Tenochtitlan, and you can see it on the map. It's high in the mountains of Mexico, and there is the capital of the Aztec Empire. And so Cortez, with just a few hundred Spanish, come to the Aztec Empire, which may have contained as many as 10 million Native Americans, estimates vary, and he was able to conquer it. Now, for a long time, historians thought about, well, how could this happen? Just 100 Spanish are able to take over such a large empire. There's various reasons for that, and all of them you need to know. One of them is guns. The Spanish had modern artillery, and we have talked about in this period, the early modern period, if you have artillery, if you have gunpowder, you're able to conquer in period 4, in the early modern period. The natives were frightened by this. They had never seen this. It looked like sticks that could make lightning and thunder, and so there was a psychological factor to their weapons. In addition to that, it was the artillery or the bullets would go right through native armor. And because they just had wicker and wooden armor. And so we could see that this was a decisive thing that would help them in combat. But by far more important than gunpowder was germs, was the introduction of European diseases, like I said, of measles and smallpox, which will wipe out most of the Native American resistance. So we've got guns and we've got germs. We've also got steel. As Jared Diamond, an author of this, a more recent author, has talked about his reasons for European conquest in his book Guns, Germs, and Steel, we see that the Europeans have steel weapons. They have steel swords, they have steel armor and steel shields, and this is much better than anything that the natives have. The natives are fighting basically with clubs that have obsidian rock woven in them. And while it's very sharp, it's very brittle, and so the Native Americans just don't have much of a chance on the battlefield. So guns, germs, and steel are also those are 3 of the major things. And then the last thing is that when Cortez lands in the mainland of Mexico, there are a lot of Native Americans who absolutely hate the Aztecs. The Aztecs had been doing human sacrifices and ruling through fear, and so a lot of the Native Americans in the region were not Aztecs, they were just tributary states of the Aztecs. And here comes the Spanish and says, look, we want to defeat the Aztecs. And so thousands of Native Americans became allies with Cortez. And so it wasn't just Cortez and his 100 or so Spanish coming to conquer the Aztec Empire. He also had a large Native American force that was backing up as well. And so for all of these reasons, we're going to see that the Spanish under Cortez are able to conquer the dominant Native American empire in Central America. Next, we go to another branch of conquest, and this is in the Andes. So here again, we see the same process play out. The Spanish, using the Caribbean as a base of operations, will send conquistadors into South America, and by talking to various tribes as they explore, they're going to find out that there's a large empire along the Andes Mountains in South America. The conquistador in charge this time is a guy by the name of Pizarro, and he is going to once again take a relatively small group of conquistadors, Spanish warriors, and conquer a much larger civilization. And the reasons for this is very similar to what we've talked about before, but there's also another factor at play here, is that Pizarro, he is going to meet with the head of the Incan Empire, and the Incan Empire, right before the Spanish had gone there, had just gone through a pretty destructive civil war as two claimants to the throne, Incan throne, were trying to take over, and so the Incan Empire has already been weakened from within. But when Pizarro meets the Incan emperor, he takes him captive, which the Incans were not expecting, and he takes him captive and holds him as hostage. And he basically says to the Incans that he will kill their emperor if they don't give him all kinds of gold and silver, which they do. And then he will go ahead and kill the emperor anyway through some misunderstandings, but also as an attempt to intimidate the Incas. And then, like I said on the previous slide, it's not just this that plays out, but in a bigger picture, Pizarro is able to conquer the Incas because he has guns, germs, and steel. All of the things that we talked about that are helping the Spanish conquer Central America. So now we have these two phases, kind of to sum up what we've talked about so far. In the early 1500s, we see that the Spanish are actively engaged in using the Caribbean as a base of operations, as we can see on that map, and then going out and sending conquistadors and conquering large parts of the New World, whether it's the Aztecs or the Incas. And so what you see on this map is what we call New Spain. This is all going to be controlled by the Spanish, so a very large area, and the Spanish are getting very, very wealthy as a result of this. The Spanish sent conquistadors to the New World, and then the crown would get a cut of all the wealth that these people stole from the Native Americans. And so we see that the Spanish are getting very wealthy, which back in Europe, as we talk about a world or interregional link, is making the Spanish very powerful in Europe out of all of this gold and silver that they're pulling out of the New World. So it's all about conquest in the early 1500s. Kill as many Native Americans as you need to conquer as much as possible. But then after conquest, the Spanish shift their interaction with the natives. It's no more just about conquest and killing. Now they don't want to kill Native Americans because they need to use them as a labor source to pull the raw materials out of the New World. So we can see here what the Spanish do is they divide up this huge area that's in red on the left-hand side. They divide it up into large provinces. So if you look on the right-hand map, we see we have New Spain and New Granada, Peru, and then La Plata. And so these are huge areas that are going to be controlled by the Spanish. And they do this because all of New Spain is just too hard for them to control at once. So they divide it up into provinces so that it'd be easier for the Spanish to control. Now, the King of Spain is not going to go to the New World. He has everything he needs in Spain, but he needs to send somebody there that he can trust that will make sure that he is getting his cut from all this New World wealth. And so he is going to send what we call a viceroy. A viceroy, it really means assistant to the king. Roy is king, or roi if you're in French. And so this assistant to the king will go to the New World, and he will make sure, in theory, that the king is getting everything he needs back from the New World, all of his cut from the riches. And so we'll have a viceroy of New Spain, a viceroy of New Granada, of Peru, La Plata. Each one of these provinces will be ruled by their own viceroy. Now, of course, the king is a little paranoid, and he doesn't want to send a viceroy over to the New World where all the wealth is. and then have the viceroy set himself up as his own king and pull the colony away from Spain. And so what he does is he also has this kind of checks and balances system where they set up this thing called audiencias. Audiencias are Spanish conquistadors or former conquistadors, nobility, that are already in New Spain, and they keep an eye on the viceroy. They audit him, and they make sure that he is not trying to set himself up as a king. And in return, the viceroy watches the audiencias. And so we have this kind of checks and balances system so that nobody gets too powerful to pull themselves away from the Spanish Empire. Now, in theory, the viceroy and the audiencias are supposed to control the entire province. However, roads in Spain, New Spain, are not very good, except for, of course, what's left of the Incan Empire. And so we see that the viceroy, even though in theory he's supposed to control all of La Plata, which we can see on the map, he really is only going to control the region around the capital city. The same thing for New Spain. We're going to rename the capital of the Aztec Empire Mexico City. And for the most part, the viceroy of all of New Spain, from what is basically California all the way down to Panama, that's all supposed to be controlled by the viceroy from Mexico City. But transportation is not very good. There are no roads. And so the viceroy, we can see, only really controls the capital city. That's really as far as his power extends, not out into the countryside because there's just no infrastructure. So on a very basic level, on a very village level, most of the Native Americans are in control of their own lives. The villages that are around in the New World of Native Americans, they don't see a lot of change here. Before the Spanish got to the New World, the villages basically would run themselves and have to pay tribute to the Aztecs, let's say. Now all that's changed is just who they're paying their tribute to. We see once again out in the countryside, Native Americans are running their own affairs through these things called village councils. And then they have to pay tribute or what have you to the local conquistador. But for the most part, they run their own lives, and it's called República de Indios. So this is a great example of a political continuity for most of the people, most of the common Native Americans, just at the village level. There are very few cities in New Spain. If you remember, we had talked about in our previous lectures that Europe is starting to become more urbanized as their trade goes up. But that is not the case in New Spain. The cities that we have are going to be on the coast for the most part, or maybe like Mexico City, a capital that was there before. But the rest of the time, there's very little trade inside of New Spain. There is trade at the coast, and so that's where we'll see the cities. And so all of the Spanish elite that go to the New World, the conquistadors and their descendants, they tried living out in the countryside on their big ranches or haciendas where they do the encomienda system. But after a while, that got really boring being out in the middle of nowhere. And so a lot of the Spanish elite, the like I said, the descendants of the conquistadors, they're going to move to the port cities, and that's where they're going to spend most of their residencies. And so we'll see that we do have cities for the most part on the coast, but in the inland, that's going to be mostly farmland and ranch land, and so not a need for a lot of cities. So these elite that move into the cities on the coast, that's where going to be all the quote unquote culture in Spain, New Spain is going to be. The colonists, we can call them colonists now of the New Spain, they're going to try to copy the latest fashions that come back from Spain, the latest educational ideas that come back from Spain, music, those kinds of things. And so the colonials in the capital cities of New Spain, we see this kind of little pocket of European culture. But for the most part, out on the countryside, things pretty much, like I said, politically stay the same. The República de Indios, the Native Americans are kind of controlling their own lives more or less. So let's switch from Spain to Portugal. If you remember, we had talked about how the Portuguese are the first to send out their explorers in Prince Henry's navigational school. And so they've been, owning the route around Africa for a long time. And we had said that the Europeans discovered the wind wheels or the Volta do Mar, and they realized that if you sail west out in the Atlantic and you take the wind wheel, you can go counterclockwise and shoot yourself across the Atlantic around the southern coast of Africa, as we can see on this furthest dotted line that goes away from Africa and then shoots back around it. Well, the Portuguese, as they were doing one of the Portuguese ship's captains, he just didn't turn left in time, and he waited a couple extra days, and he ran to the coast of Brazil. before he turned his big counterclockwise turn to get around to Africa. So the Portuguese accidentally discover South America, and so Brazil becomes a Portuguese colony. So we see that for the most part, the Spanish control most of the New World, but the Portuguese are also going to control what is modern day Brazil. Even today, the people in Brazil speak Portuguese. And so we have a conflict brewing. The Spanish say that the New World belongs to them. The Portuguese say that they have a part of the New World too. And so they start jostling with each other and they start competing, and we look like we might have some war. But to avoid war between two very Catholic countries, the Pope, he works out a treaty. It's called the Treaty of Tordesillas, that allows the Portuguese and the Spanish to split the New World without any kind of conflict. Let's take again this back to a world link. Europe is going through the Reformation, and the last thing the Pope wants is Catholic countries killing each other when they should be fighting Protestant countries. And so, what the Pope does at the Treaty of Tordesillas, he draws a line around the earth. It just goes all the way around the earth at a certain line of longitude. And basically, it says that everything between these two lines, as you see on your map, that's going to be controlled by the Portuguese. So, Brazil and the route around Africa, and then most of India. Well, India. And then everything on the outside of those lines, that's going to be Spanish control. So the Spanish will get most of the New World, and they'll get the Philippines, which we've already talked about that they did conquer. And this seems to make, for the most part, everybody happy. Well, except nobody asked the Africans, the Indians, or the Americans if they wanted this, but that was not necessarily what the Europeans were thinking about at the time. And so we see that the world is now divided between two European countries, according to the Europeans. The Portuguese they'll run Brazil very similar to what we saw on the previous slide to the Spanish. The Portuguese king will send a viceroy to the New World, and he will be in charge of running Brazil for the Portuguese crown. The Portuguese are going to find out that Brazil it's kind of like it's a surprise for them. They realize that even though they weren't looking for Brazil, when they find it, that Brazil is very tropical, it's on the equator, and they can grow sugar there. And so not only can the Portuguese grow sugar on their islands in the Azores and the Canary Islands in the Atlantic, but now they have a huge chunk of land that they can grow as much sugar as they possibly can in Brazil. So Brazil becomes a large moneymaker for the Portuguese Empire. Now, just like in the Caribbean, the Portuguese will try to use Native Americans that they find in Brazil as a labor source to grow the sugar. But growing sugar is a very laborious task. It's very dangerous. They're worked to death. It's very harsh work. And so a lot of the Native Americans either die from European diseases or they just run off into the tropical rainforest. And the Portuguese cannot go after them. They would get lost or die. And so we see that Native Americans, once again, are not a very good labor source. And so we can see on this map on the bottom right-hand corner, the Portuguese are going to start importing a large number of African slaves to work in their sugar plantations. Also, you can see on the map that by far, the vast majority of Africans that come to the New World because of the slave trade come from West Africa, because it's closer, and they'll also go either to Brazil or they'll go to the Caribbean to grow sugar. A very small percentage, maybe 5% of the African Americans that come to the New World will go to what will be the United States later on. And so by far, most Africans are being brought to the New World to grow sugar on Spanish and Portuguese plantations. So Iberian society in the New World, this will work for both the Portuguese and the Spanish. Socially, what was the social structure like in Europe? Well, the Spanish and the Portuguese brought very few families to the New World. That was not the point. The point of coming to the New World was not to settle and to have and raise a family. The point was to make money. And whether it was the conquistadors looking for gold and silver, or later on looking to grow cash crops, sugar, this is a business venture. And at this time, Europe said that business was for men, and so it was mostly men who came to the New World. Plus, it's very dangerous coming to the New World. There's conflict, you could die, there's diseases. And so we see it's almost all Spanish and Portuguese men that come to the New World. Because of that, we're going to see a very quick blending between the Spanish and Portuguese and the Native Americans. The men who come to the New World, they have power and control over a lot of Native Americans, including women, and they can basically force these women to do whatever they want with them. And so we see that lots of Spanish men and Portuguese men too, but they will have sexual relations with the Native Americans, sometimes consensual, sometimes not. And from this union will come a new group of people called mestizos. Mestizos is a physical blending of Spanish and Native American, and it was usually a Spanish father and a Native American mother. And so this is a good example of a change in the New World. Before the Spanish came, it was all Native American, and then we have after contact, we have Native American, we have Spanish, Portuguese, and we also have this new blending of people called mestizo. Brazil, however, the Portuguese are going to be a little bit more diverse because the Portuguese will bring in a lot of slaves into the New World. And so Brazil is known for even being more diverse than the Spanish colonies. And so we see that when we have mulattoes, we will have that a mulatto is a person with European and African descent. And so we'll see that result. We still have mestizo. And then we're also going to see a blending of European slave and Indian. Um, I'm sorry, not European, a blending of slaves and Native Americans, and that is called Zambos. When some of these African Americans run away from the plantations and they may go live with the Native Americans, the union that results is called Zambos. And so a very, very diverse new kind of situation going on in the New World. And so here we see from the time period, a Spaniard draws this all the different ethnic combinations that you could have, and it becomes very diverse. And so not only can you have a mestizo, which is part European and part Native American, but what we see here is then they also go into even further. You know, maybe you're a 1/4 European and then you're 3/4 Native American. That would be a certain designation. Or maybe you're 1/4 European, half Native American, and 1/4 African slave, and that's another designation. And so we see that race plays a very important part in your social standing in the New World. The color of your skin and also your ancestral background, and that will determine your social status up and down the social classes. So let's look at that social system. So we typically draw this social pyramid to represent societies in world history. At the very top, with the most power and also the smallest group, we have these people called the peninsulares. The peninsulares means that they were born in Spain on the peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula, and they came to the New World either as conquistadors or viceroys, but they were usually educated in universities of Europe where their family is nobility, and they came here to make their wealth in the New World. And so they have the highest status. They're very wealthy, and they typically, like I said, live in the capital cities or the trade cities on the coast. Underneath them, we have the Creoles. Now, Creoles are also entirely of European descent, but the only difference is that they were born in the Americas. They're colonists. And so their parents may have been peninsulares, but now they're here, and so they're called Creoles, their children. Now, the Creoles still have very high social status. If you look on this chart, they're very near the top, and there's more of them. But they're not as considered as high social status as the peninsulares. They're just colonials. They haven't spent any time in Spain. They might have a different accent than the people who are from Spain over time. They didn't go to the University of Madrid, or they have never been to court, and so they're kind of considered backwater Spaniards. They're not as, if you, for lack of a better term, as hip as the people from Spain themselves. They're kind of these colonials. I mean, they're white and all, they're Spanish and all, but they're not as good as the peninsulares. And then if we go further down the pyramid and we see more people, we get mestizos, and they have fairly high status because they have some Caucasian in them. One of their parents or grandparents was a Creole or a Peninsulare, and so they have access to more education. They may have had access to more wealth growing up, and so we see that they have more opportunities. And then at the bottom, we see mulattoes and zambos, natives and slaves. We could probably just combine those four groups into one section at the bottom. And these people have very low social status because they have less and less Caucasian in them. They have less opportunity in life. And so we see that they're mostly used for manual laborers on the plantations. And so they don't have a lot of economic mobility. And we can see that they're going to have very hard physical lives to try to make, on a daily basis. So now let's talk about religion. What are some changes that we see in religion in the New World? Well, before Spanish and Portuguese contact, we saw, as we talked about in previous lectures, that the natives believe in animism, or nature spirits, and then also polytheistic nature gods if they're farmers. And so we had talked about the Aztecs doing human sacrifices, and also, belief in the nature spirits. However, as the Spanish come and they bring their Jesuit priests, we see that the natives are going to gradually become Catholic. They're going to become Christian. Now, the natives do this for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they convert because they're forced to. It's either death or conversion, and a lot of people will choose conversion. Other times the natives converted willingly because they thought that their gods had deserted them. The Spanish came in and they were able to conquer. The Native Americans are dying off so quickly that, maybe the Spanish god is a more powerful god. And so the natives willingly convert because it seems like, well, why not be on the winning side and the god that has more power? And so we see conversions for different reasons. Next, we're going to see that even when the natives do convert, or even if they pretend they're converting, we see that they don't give up all of their native faith. This just is not how we see things work in world history. And so we get this cultural blending between the faiths. It's called the syncretic faith. That means when you take aspects of two faiths or more and combine them into one. And so the Native Americans, coming from a polytheistic background, they like one aspect of Catholicism very much is that Catholicism has a whole bunch of saints that you can pray to intercede on your behalf with God, and it's like your patron saint. It's a source of comfort. And so the Native Americans, they see all these different saints, and they kind of see that to their mind, it's kind of like polytheism. And so it makes the conversion from polytheism to monotheism to Catholicism a little bit easier because they're used to this idea of being able to have different gods for different things, and the Catholics have different patron saints for different things. And even though it's different, it's similar enough that the Native Americans can have this smooth transition. So this is an example of cultural diffusion, that it's very easy for the Native Americans to make this conversion. And so we get something in the New World. It's called the cult of the saints. It's this real emphasis on saints in Native American faith, this new Native American Catholic faith. And like I said, this emphasis is a little bit more strong than we might see back in Spain. This veneration of Catholic saints, and so this is a great example of syncretism, right? Of syncretic faith. Now we see literature. And so before the Spanish came to the New World, the Aztecs did have a written form of language. It was pictographic, and here we can see a picture of it. The Aztecs had symbols for words, so they could record great deeds of kings, or the priest could record prayers, those kinds of things. And they wrote all of these things down, among other places, on a codex. A codex was an Aztec book, very colorful and beautiful, that was made from bark of trees. Like I said, to record the deeds of kings, or special hymns and chants and prayers. Well, when the Spanish come to the New World, the Jesuit priests see this as paganism. It's an example of all their Aztec gods, and so they'll do their very best to burn or destroy all the codexes. There are very few left today, not very many at all, but of the few we do have, we could use these to study Aztec religion before the Spanish came. However, after the Spanish come to the New World, what we're going to see is that the Aztec language, both spoken and written, is going to disappear, and in favor of Spanish. Spanish becomes the language that the natives have to speak. And so today, when you go to the region, most of the Native Americans have Native American descent, they will speak Spanish predominantly. And so we see on the left-hand side, we see some Spanish text being written as this monk, or probably a Jesuit priest, describes some of the people that he saw in the Aztec culture and costumes. Next, we're going to go to Iberian colonial economies. So this is the economic portion of New Spain. And so we're going to start with ranching and farming. By far, most of the economic activity that went on in New Spain, because it's such a big area, is going to be ranching. The Spanish are going to bring cattle to the New World, something that the New World didn't have as part of the Columbian Exchange. And we have these large grassy open spaces in the New World. And so the Spanish, a large part of their income will be shipping cows, growing cattle to feed the populations of their colonies. In addition to that, they'll be farming. Of course, there's all kinds of new crops being introduced to the New World, like wheat, but also they're going to continue to grow maize. So that's an economic continuity that the Native Americans and now the Spanish will continue to grow maize in the New World. Next, we see a labor change over time, so economic change over time as far as labor systems go. So before the Spanish had gotten there, I had told you that the Aztecs or the Incas used the Native Americans that they were controlling as a tributary labor source. And so we're going to see that continue. When the Spanish come to the New World, now most of the Native Americans are just going to have a new overlord, as it were, somebody telling them what to do. And we had previously talked about encomiendas. And so when the Spanish first take over the New World, we had talked about how the Spanish live on the hacienda and they run the hacienda in the encomienda system. And then, if you remember, I told you over time the Creoles and the Peninsulares, the Spanish in charge, they get sick of being out in the middle of nowhere, and so they move their permanent residence to the capital city or the port city. And they pretty much leave the Native Americans to run their own affairs as long as they pay their tribute. Well, this evolves, so we go from the encomienda system to what was called debt peonage, where the Native Americans under the encomienda system, they're constantly supervised by the Spanish because the Spanish are living with them. And then later on, as the Spanish move back to the capital cities or the coastal cities, we see it's the debt peonage system. No longer are the Spanish controlling the day-to-day activities of the Native Americans. What they're doing is they're coming back for basically tribute. They're telling the Native Americans, look, I'm going to let you grow crops on my land. The European is saying it's my land now. And I'll give you seeds and I'll give you tools. When I come back at the end of the year, you have to repay me the debt you owe me for letting you grow crops on my land by giving me a share of the crop. Sometimes it's called sharecropping, but here in the Spanish part of the New World, we're going to call it debt peonage. So it's a coercive labor system, but it's not as severe as the encomienda system. It's certainly not as severe as slavery. Now let's go over to the left-hand side and we'll talk about mining. Now, mining did happen, of course, before the Spanish got there. Most notably, the Inca, they have this place called Potosí, which is a mountain in South America that is very rich in gold and silver, especially silver deposits. And so the Inca, they had forced neighboring Native Americans to provide them with a labor tax to go dig in the very dangerous mines to bring out silver for the Incan overlords. And this was called the Mita system. It was forced labor, a coercive labor system that forced Native Americans, their fellow Native Americans who weren't Inca, to go and mine silver for them. And when the Spanish get to the New World and they discover the silver source, they're like, well, if it works for the Incas, it's certainly going to work for us. And so here's an economic continuity. The Spanish are going to continue the Mita system as a labor tax. And we see that, for the most part, this is going to be the majority of the way the Spanish get their silver out of the New World, by using this Mita tax to force the Native Americans to go several months of the year into these very dangerous mines to bring out the silver. Then what we see as the last thing on the slide is the impact of silver globally. The Spanish are bringing so much silver out of the New World. Not only are they sending the silver back to Spain, helping Spain to become more powerful, but they're also sending lots of silver on the Manila galleons over to Manila and then eventually to China to pay for all the Chinese goods. So the world market of silver is getting injected with all of these tons of silver suddenly. And what happens is it takes this thing called inflation. Inflation is when prices go up dramatically, and it makes people have a hard time buying the basic necessities of life because their wages don't keep up with inflation. Every day the prices keep going up and up and up, but their owners or their bosses don't give them more wage, they don't give them more pay. And so inflation can be very devastating to an economy. And so this is kind of counterintuitive. You would think that the economy of Spain and China is getting better because of all the silver flowing into their economies from the New World. But in fact, it ends up hurting the common people in their economies because the prices of everything just keep going up and up and up. The reason prices go up is because if I own a shop and I'm selling shoes, let's just say, if I know that everybody has more silver, more money in their pockets, it makes sense that I would raise my prices because I know they can pay more. And so we're going to see the economies of Spain and China struggle a little bit at times because of this inflationary trend that's being caused by all the silver coming from the New World. Now, the Native Americans, they resist. I mean, after the Spanish come to the New World and conquer the Aztecs and Incas, Do they just give up after that? Is there any form of resistance? Do the Native Americans like working for the Spanish? Obviously, the answer is no. And so there's all kinds of ways that Native Americans start to resist after they've been conquered by the Spanish. One is they purposely work as slow as possible. Let's say you're working on an in the encomienda system or even later in debt peonage. What you do is you work as slow as possible so that the people who control you over the years, they just get used to you. They just get used to thinking that all you produce is less and less. And so if you work really slow during the day, over time, the person who's in charge of you will get used to you working slow, and they'll gradually start to think that's the most you can do in a day. So this is a form of resistance, working slow to lower your employer's expectations. The next thing, of course, is running away. Excuse me. Especially in the Caribbean, we see this as an option. Native Americans, or even some African Americans, would run away into the mountains, um, where the sorry, I still have a cold, where the Europeans had a tough time finding them. And so, running away is a form of resistance, as a form of keeping away from working for somebody you don't want to. In fact, in some of these places where the African Americans ran away into the mountains and they found Native Americans who had also escaped, they blend together and form what we call maroon communities. Maroon communities are communities of African Americans and sometimes blended with Native Americans that are independent, away from white society, running their own lives, their own affairs. Out and out rebellion is very rare because the Spanish have all the weapons and all the power, but it does happen. And so, an example of this kind of peasant rebellion is the Pueblo Rebellion or the Popes Revolt. It happens in 1680 in what is currently now New Mexico, northern New Spain, and the Native Americans resent being controlled by the Spanish. They don't like having their culture and religion changed. They don't like working for the Spanish. And so what we see is they rebel, and for several years they are able to keep the Spanish out. They rise up, they kill the priests, they kill the Peninsulares and the Creoles in the area, and they're able to have kind of once again revert back to their own culture and controlling themselves. But eventually, the Spanish are able to come back with superior weapons and conquer them. So this is the best example we can give you as an out-and-out rebellion of the Native Americans in New Spain. Our last slide for this lecture in part one is the Brazilian economy. So we had talked about Brazil. When you think of Brazil, you should think of sugar immediately. Brazil is a very large place, it's tropical, and so the Spanish are going to do everything they possibly can to bring as much sugar out of Brazil as possible. Sugar means tremendous profits. And so we're going to see it's a sugar economy. Because of that, very few Portuguese can come to Brazil and grow sugar. It's just such a large investment. You have to buy the land, you have to buy the processing, you have to buy all the slaves, you have to buy the tools and the seeds. And so, for the most part, we don't see much of a middle class in Brazil. You just have this wide wealth gap. You have the Peninsulares and you have the Creoles, you have the white Portuguese, and then you have everybody else at the bottom. And there's not a lot of middle class either in the Caribbean or the Spanish Caribbean or in Brazil. This cash crop economy doesn't fit a middle class. And so we see this wealth gap. And to some extent, we have seen this continue still today in Latin American countries where we have this large wealth gap. They've had trouble over world history establishing this middle class because of this pattern that's set up here as well. The wealthy, they start by controlling everything, and we have a tough time getting them to relinquish the control they have over the land and all of the wealth. So next we have a large labor force. We had already talked previously about all of the African slaves that are brought in and why they didn't use Native Americans. And so we're going to see a large number of African Americans brought to Brazil and the Caribbean. In fact, if you go to Haiti or the Dominican Republic today or parts of Brazil, you're going to see most of the people there have African ancestry because of this early modern labor experience, economy where you're bringing in all of these African Americans to work on the large plantations. We have previously talked about why we don't use Native Americans in Brazil because they run away or die, and so that brings in African slaves. Harsh treatment. We are going to see a trend as we go through the rest of our notes is that the more money you can make on a plantation, the more slaves you tend to go through. the Portuguese and the Spanish and the Caribbean are making so much money off of the sugar that there are tremendous profits to be made, and so they can afford to bring in a lot of slaves and work them basically to death in some plantations. And they can afford to do this because they're making such profit. Now, if they were growing a crop that doesn't grow that has a lot of profit, like tobacco, which we'll talk about when we talk about North America, you can't afford to mistreat your slaves because you can't keep buying more slaves because your profit margin isn't that high. But here on sugar plantations, the work is very backbreaking. It's very hard, and so they will just mow through lots of African slaves in their quest for profits. So when we come back, we will shift our notes to North America and the English and French experience in the Americas.